We can finally reveal the performance numbers of Intel's Rocket Lake 11th Gen desktop CPUs, and in this article we'll be focusing on the Core i5-11600K and Core i7-11700K and how they stack up against the Ryzen 5600X and Ryzen 7580X. The Core i5-11600K is set to retail for less than $300, while the Ryzen 5560X costs well over $300, while the Core i7-11700K should retail for around $400, while the Ryzen 7580X currently costs over $500. For more performance analysis and review of the Core i9-11900K, you can see my additional coverage in the article below. My test system uses drivers and Windows 10 updates that were up to date as of March 2021, and I've retested every CPU in the graphs too. I'd check every review out there to make sure they state the same, as these things do make a big difference to the results. The hardware includes an Nvidia RTX 3070, custom water cooling system featuring Corsair Hydro X components and a Barrow Ropilema test bench. I've also used 16 GB of Corsair 3466 MHz Vengeance Pro RGB memory along with an ERM850i power supply. I used an MSI MEG Z490 Ace motherboard to test the 10th Gen Intel CPUs, an Asus Maximus XIII Hero motherboard to test the Intel 11th Gen CPUs, and MSI MEG X570 Unify to test the AMD CPUs. Overclocking settings: Ryzen 9595X 4.6 GHz, 1.268V Ryzen 9590X 4.6 GHz, 1.25V Ryzen 7580X 4.6 GHz, 1.25V Ryzen 5560X 4.7 GHz, 1.25V Core i9-11900K, 5.1 GHz, 1.4V Core i7-11700K, 4.9 GHz, 1.38V Core i5-11600K, 4.8 GHz, 1.35V Intel Core i9-10900K, 5.1 GHz, 1.3V Core i9-10850K, 5.1 GHz, 1.35V Core i7-10700K, 5.1 GHz, 1.325V Core i5-10600K, 5.1 GHz. Using 1.32 VIV included both Cinebench R23 and the old R20, for the simple reason if you're familiar with Cinebench numbers, then your brain still likely works in R20. I know mine does. Below you can see the multi-threaded test in Cinebench R23, and here the Ryzen 5560X is matched by the cheaper Core i5-11600K despite costing more. The Core i7-11700K also does a good job of keeping up with the pricier Ryzen 7580X and even managed to better the Core i9-10850K, which has 2 more cores. Intel has certainly made major strides with lightly threaded performance too, and the Core i9-11900K managed to top the chart, beating the mighty Ryzen 9595X. The Core i7-11700K and Core i5-11600K meanwhile matched the more expensive Ryzen 7580X and Ryzen 5560X. Cinebench R20 saw the Core i7-11700K sit a couple of hundred points behind the Ryzen 7580X but matched the Core i9-10850K, which has 2 more cores. The Core i5-11600K, meanwhile, again matched the more expensive Ryzen 5560X. The single-threaded R20 test seemed to favor AMD a little more in some areas, but again the Core i5-11600K matched the Ryzen 5560X, and the Core i7-11700K was only a little way behind the Ryzen 7580X, with both CPUs being miles faster than their predecessors too. This is a new test and only had time to put key CPUs through the benchmark and only at stock speed.